After nearly 2 years of total silence, one of Hollywood's most talked about legal battles just got a new chapter, and it didn't come from a courtroom, a press release, or a leaked text message. It came from a short video posted directly to Instagram from the two people who had said almost nothing publicly since the whole thing began. What they chose to say, and just as importantly what they chose not to say, tells you a lot about where this story stands right now. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what was said, what it means, and what still hasn't been resolved. But before we get into it, if you appreciate clear, level-headed breakdowns of stories like this, instead of the usual noise and speculation, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people, and I appreciate every one of you who takes the time to do it. So here's the setup. This whole saga traces back to the 2024 film It Ends With Us, based on the best-selling Colleen Hoover novel. The movie starred Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, who also directed it. On paper, it should have been a straightforward success story, a beloved book turned into a major theatrical release. Instead, it became one of the messiest, most dissected legal dramas in recent Hollywood memory. And what makes this particular update interesting isn't just that Baldoni finally spoke. It's how he chose to do it, what tone he struck, and what that might signal about where things go from here. Stick around, because there's a financial detail near the end of this video that a lot of people are still confused about. Let's rewind for a second, because if you haven't followed every twist of this story, the background matters here. In December of 2024, Blake Lively went public with allegations against Justin Baldoni. She said she experienced harassment during the production of the film, and she also alleged that Baldoni and people connected to his production company, Wayfarer Studios, attempted to damage her reputation afterward. She first filed a complaint with a California civil rights agency, and that complaint eventually turned into a full federal lawsuit. This is the part where a lot of people get confused about how Hollywood legal disputes actually work, so let's break it down simply. When someone files a complaint like this, it doesn't mean a court has decided anything yet. It just means the legal process has officially started. From there, both sides typically hire legal teams, gather evidence, and prepare for what could eventually become a trial, unless the two sides settle before that happens. That's an important distinction to hold on to, because it explains a lot of what happened over the following year and a half. Now, before we go further, it helps to understand just how this went from a private workplace complaint to a headline in nearly every major outlet in the country within days. Around the very end of December 2024, a major newspaper published an in-depth report detailing Lively's allegations, along with what were described as internal text messages and communications involving people connected to the film's production and its public relations strategy. That article is really what pushed this story out of the entertainment trade press and into mainstream news. Once those details became public, Baldoni's side didn't just respond with a simple statement. His team filed a lawsuit against the newspaper itself, alleging libel and false light invasion of privacy, arguing that the reporting had been unfair or misleading. On that very same day, Lively converted her initial complaint into a formal lawsuit against Baldoni. So, within a span of hours, you essentially had two major legal fronts opening at once, one aimed at a media outlet and one aimed directly at a former co-star. This is actually a good moment to pause and explain a distinction that trips a lot of people up when they follow stories like this. A defamation claim and a workplace harassment claim are not the same type of legal action, even though they can get tangled together in public conversation. A harassment or retaliation claim is generally about how someone was treated in a workplace setting. A defamation claim is about whether false, damaging statements were made about a person publicly. In this case, you had both types of claims running simultaneously, involving overlapping people, which is a huge part of why this story became so difficult for casual observers to follow. Some headlines were about the original workplace allegations, others were about the media coverage of those allegations, and still others were about the countersuit that was coming. Speaking of which, not long after Lively's allegations became public, Baldoni didn't stay quiet through his legal team, even though he personally wasn't giving interviews. In January of 2025, he and his company countersued. This countersuit accused Lively, along with her husband, actor Ryan Reynolds, and the couple's publicist, of defamation and even extortion, claiming they had tried to seize control of the film and damage his reputation in the press. At one point, that countersuit reportedly sought as much as $400 million in damages. That number alone is part of why this case captured so much attention. Lawsuits happen in Hollywood all the time, but rarely at that scale, and rarely involving names this recognizable. Shortly after, the various claims and countersuits were consolidated into a single case, which is actually a fairly common move in complex litigation. Rather than having several separate lawsuits moving through the court system at different paces, consolidating them lets one judge oversee the entire dispute, which tends to make the process more efficient, even if it doesn't necessarily make it any less dramatic from the outside. Here's where many people lose track of the details, because from that point on, the case became incredibly complicated, with multiple claims moving through the courts at different speeds. This past spring, a judge dismissed a significant portion of both Baldoni's defamation and extortion claims against Lively and Reynolds, and also narrowed down parts of Lively's original harassment claims, including the ones specifically about conduct on set. However, the court allowed part of Lively's case, specifically her request tied to legal expenses and certain retaliation claims involving Baldoni's public relations team, to continue moving forward under a specific California law known as Civil Code Section 47.1. That law is designed to protect people who report workplace misconduct from being hit with retaliatory defamation lawsuits afterward. In plain terms, the idea behind that law is that if you make a good faith complaint about harassment or misconduct, you shouldn't then be punished with a separate lawsuit simply for having spoken up. That's the legal mechanism that ended up mattering most in the later stages of this case, and it's ultimately what shaped how the financial side of this dispute was resolved. Think of it a bit like this. Imagine two neighbors get into a dispute, and one of them calls a building inspector to report a safety violation. If the other neighbor then turns around and sues them for defamation just for making that report, most legal systems have some kind of protection in place to prevent that kind of retaliatory lawsuit from succeeding, because otherwise, nobody would ever feel safe reporting problems in the first place. That's roughly the underlying principle behind the specific law that ended up applying here, just translated into a Hollywood production and a multi-million-dollar legal fight instead of a neighborhood dispute. Then, just 2 weeks before the case was set to go to trial this past May, both sides reached a settlement. No trial, no public verdict laying out exactly what happened on that set. Just an agreement to resolve the dispute, confirmed through a joint statement from both legal teams. For a case this heavily covered, that ending surprised a lot of people who expected a courtroom showdown all the way to the finish line. But settlements like this are actually common in high-profile cases, largely because trials are expensive, unpredictable, and prolong the exposure for everyone involved, win or lose. Even after that settlement, the story wasn't quite finished, and this is honestly the part that's caused the most confusion online. In June, a federal judge ruled that Baldoni and his production company would be required to pay a significant portion of Lively's legal fees, tied specifically to the unsuccessful defamation and extortion lawsuit he had filed against her. Reports have detailed the figure down to the dollar, with Lively's legal team seeking a little over $7 million in attorney's fees, on top of roughly $500,000 in additional litigation expenses, bringing the total requested figure to just above $8 million. Baldoni's side reportedly had a window of time to either accept that amount or contest it further in court. It's worth pointing out clearly what this ruling was and wasn't about, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets flattened in a headline. It wasn't a verdict on the original harassment allegations themselves, since those specific claims were resolved through the settlement rather than a trial verdict. It was specifically about who bears the financial cost of the legal fight tied to Baldoni's countersuit, based on that Section 47.1 protection we just talked about. In other words, the ruling essentially said that because Baldoni's defamation and extortion claims were found to conflict with a law protecting people who report misconduct, he was responsible for covering the legal costs Lively incurred defending herself against those specific claims. That distinction matters a great deal because a lot of casual coverage made it sound like a jury had definitively decided who was right and who was wrong in the original harassment dispute, when in reality, this particular ruling was much narrower and more technical than that. Now, here's something else that adds an interesting wrinkle to all of this, and it's a detail that a lot of people following this case closely found genuinely surprising. After the ruling on legal fees came down, Baldoni's attorney, Brian Friedman, made an unusual move. He chose to publicly release the full settlement agreement between the two sides. Normally, settlements like this stay confidential, sealed away from public view for good, largely so both sides can move on without every private term becoming a permanent part of the public record. Friedman even went on a media appearance, sitting down with television host Megyn Kelly to explain his reasoning directly. His stated goal, in his own words, was to give people what he called finality. The idea being that with so much speculation, rumor, and half-true information still circulating online nearly 2 years after the initial allegations, putting the actual, literal agreement out there for anyone to read could help settle some of that noise once and for all. Whether or not that strategy actually worked is honestly up for debate. If you've spent any time in the comment sections of articles about this case, you'll notice public fascination hasn't slowed down much at all. If anything, releasing the settlement seemed to generate a fresh wave of analysis, with people combing through the specific language of the agreement, looking for clues about who came out ahead. That's actually a pretty common pattern with high-profile legal settlements in general. The intent behind releasing information is usually to close the book on a story, but the actual effect is often just opening a new chapter of public discussion. Which finally brings us to the moment that's making headlines right now. This past Wednesday, Justin Baldoni posted a video to Instagram, and this time, he wasn't alone. His wife, Emily Baldoni, sat beside him, and together, they addressed the public for the first time since this entire saga began nearly 2 years ago. If you've been waiting for some kind of dramatic reveal or explosive accusation, that's genuinely not what this was. Instead, it was measured, emotional in tone, but notably restrained in substance. Justin opened by acknowledging just how long they had stayed quiet. He explained that despite having plenty they could have said, something kept telling them to hold back every time they considered recording a video like this, that the timing never quite felt right until now. Emily followed that up by describing the last 2 years in terms of injustice and pain, saying that feeling of gratitude they now have doesn't erase or negate everything else they went through. She went on to say they had struggled to understand how a situation like this could unfold in the first place, describing it at one point as something that felt disguised as a fight for women, without going any further into specifics about what she meant by that. Neither of them used this moment to relitigate the specific legal claims in detail or attack anyone by name directly. Instead, the tone leaned heavily on gratitude, resilience, and family, with Justin at one point summarizing the entire experience in a single word, calling it an injustice, before quickly pivoting the conversation toward everything they say they're thankful for. It's also worth noting they specifically addressed why they were speaking now rather than earlier, and why in a short video rather than a longer interview. Justin explained that he and Emily didn't want to add to what he described as noise, and that too many things had already been said publicly over the past 2 years that simply weren't accurate. Rather than getting into a public back and forth correcting every individual claim, their approach seems to have been to let the legal process play out fully first, and only speak once that process had actually reached its conclusion. Whether you agree with that strategy or not, it's a fairly deliberate and calculated choice, not something that appears to have been posted impulsively. This is actually a pattern worth noticing if you follow how public figures handle the aftermath of major legal disputes. There's a version of this moment where someone comes out swinging, using their platform to settle scores publicly after the courtroom fight is over. That's not the approach Baldoni and his wife took here. Instead, they leaned into language about healing, about their family, friends, community, and faith being what carried them through. Justin specifically described healing as something that isn't linear, something that looks different depending on the day. That kind of framing tends to resonate with audiences precisely because it doesn't try to declare a clean, tidy victory. It presents the aftermath as something still being processed. At the same time, both of them made clear this isn't necessarily the last word. There were hints throughout the video that more could be shared eventually, just not right now. That's an important detail because it suggests this video functioned less like a full tell-all and more like an initial acknowledgement, a way of finally breaking a long silence without necessarily addressing every specific claim from the lawsuit itself. So what does this actually tell us? A few things. First, from a purely legal standpoint, the core dispute is resolved. There was a settlement, there was a ruling on legal fees, and the litigation itself has concluded. Second, from a public relations standpoint, this video signals that Baldoni is choosing to re-enter the public conversation carefully, leading with gratitude and family rather than pointed rebuttals. And third, based on the language both of them used, this likely isn't the final public statement we'll hear from either side of this saga. Given how much attention this case has generated and how many unanswered questions remain in the public's mind, it wouldn't be surprising if more details, interviews, or statements emerge over time. Naturally, a video like this generates a wide range of public reaction, and this one was no exception. Some viewers expressed sympathy, saying it seemed like Baldoni had stayed quiet and dignified throughout an incredibly difficult stretch of time. Others pushed back hard, arguing that after everything that had been alleged, a short video focused mostly on gratitude didn't really address the substance of what actually happened during production. And plenty of people landed somewhere in between, simply expressing that the entire saga, regardless of who bears more responsibility, has been an unusually strange and uncomfortable chapter for Hollywood to work through in public. That range of reaction is honestly pretty typical for a case like this. When a story runs for nearly 2 years, generates hundreds of articles, and touches on genuinely serious allegations, no single video is going to satisfy everyone watching, no matter how it's framed or delivered. It's also worth remembering, whenever a story like this is still actively developing, that details can shift quickly. Settlement terms, legal rulings, and public statements are all matters of public record that continue to be reported on as new information becomes available. So if this topic matters to you, it's worth checking reputable entertainment and legal news sources directly for the most current developments, rather than relying solely on secondhand summaries, including this one. To bring it all together, here's what we know for certain right now. The legal battle between Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively, which began with harassment and retaliation allegations back in 2024, escalated into dueling multi-million-dollar lawsuits, and ultimately ended in a settlement just before trial this past May. Baldoni was later ordered to cover a substantial portion of Lively's legal fees, a figure north of $8 million. And now, for the first time since this all began, Baldoni and his wife have publicly addressed the situation directly, choosing a tone built around gratitude, healing, and family, rather than confrontation. Whether this marks the true end of the public conversation around this case or just the beginning of a new chapter is something we'll likely find out in the months ahead. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what's going on instead of just adding to the noise, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you want more clear, level-headed coverage of stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I'd genuinely love to hear your take in the comments, whether you think this is the end of the story or just another chapter, and make sure your notifications are turned on so you catch the next update the moment it happens.